April 16th, 1945. Somewhere in the Ruhr Valley, the world arrived in fragments. First the antiseptic sting in his nostrils, then the impossible softness beneath his shattered body, then voices speaking English with an accent he'd been trained to fear. Oberleutnant Helmut Hesse opened his eyes to white ceiling tiles instead of the gray April sky he remembered, and for a moment believed he had died. The morphine made everything drift at the edges, but the pain in his right arm remained sharp and specific, a steel spike driven from wrist to shoulder. He tried to lift his head. Failed. Tried to remember the sequence of events that had delivered him here, to this clean room that smelled of iodine and ether instead of cordite and mud. The last clear memory, the howl of incoming shells. His company scattered across a roadside ditch near Hagen, the Ruhr pocket collapsing like a lung. Then the shell burst, close, too close, and the sensation of being lifted and slammed down simultaneously, his helmet ringing like a bell against his skull, and something hot tearing through his right forearm with the sound of snapping wood. After that, only sensory chaos, the taste of dirt and blood. His sergeant's face, mouth moving without sound, hands dragging him backward. The awareness of surrender, that final unthinkable word, arriving not as shame but as relief so profound it felt like blasphemy. And now this, a private room, a real bed with laundered sheets, an IV line feeding clear fluid into his uninjured arm. Through the morphine haze, Hesse's mind groped toward the propaganda he'd internalized over 12 years of National Socialist education. The Americans were supposed to be barbaric, cultural mongrels, Jew-controlled degenerates who would torture German prisoners, who would leave wounded men to rot in their own filth as punishment for the crimes of the Reich. He'd seen the pamphlets, heard the radio broadcasts, absorbed the whispered stories that circulated through the Wehrmacht during the long retreat. Americans scalping prisoners, Americans using captured soldiers for medical experiments, Americans leaving the wounded to die of infected wounds in makeshift cages. The door opened. A woman entered, 30s, dark hair pinned beneath a white cap, captain's bars on her collar. An American Army nurse. She checked the IV, made a note on a clipboard, then met his eyes. "You're awake," she said in accented but competent German. "Good. The surgeon will want to examine you this afternoon." Hesse's throat felt lined with sand. "Where?" The word came out as a rasp. "Field Hospital 77, near Remscheid. You were operated on about 6 hours ago. Compound fracture of the radius and ulna, moderate concussion. You're lucky. Another hour, and you would have lost the arm to infection." Lucky. The words seemed to arrive from another universe. She adjusted his pillow without asking permission, the gesture so casually professional it felt surreal. "Do you need anything for pain? The morphine should last another 2 hours. But I can check with the doctor if you're uncomfortable." He stared at her. This was the enemy. This woman in her crisp uniform, speaking matter-of-factly about his comfort, belonged to the nation his leaders had declared subhuman, decadent, doomed. And she was offering him pain relief. Why? The question escaped before he could stop it. Her expression shifted, not quite sympathy, not quite impatience. "Because you have a compound fracture, Oberleutnant. Pain management is standard medical protocol." She left before he could formulate another question. Hesse lay still, tracking the shadows on the ceiling, trying to reconcile what his senses reported with what his education demanded he believe. The Ruhr pocket, the Ruhr Kessel, as German soldiers called it with grim humor, was the Wehrmacht's final convulsion in the West. By early April of 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model commanded more than 300,000 German troops and 24 generals encircled by American 1st and 9th Armies in an industrial region roughly the size of Rhode Island. Hitler operating from his Bundy in Berlin with maps that bore little resemblance to reality had forbidden retreat. Model, understanding the mathematical certainty of defeat, had nevertheless obeyed, binding his forces to a defense that could end only in annihilation or surrender. Helmut Hesse had entered this pocket as a believer, not in Hitler. He'd long since learned to separate tactical reality from ideological fantasy, but in duty, in the abstract notion that German soldiers fought with discipline until the end. He joined the Wehrmacht in 1939 at age 21, driven less by Nazi fervor than by the traditional Prussian conception of military service as civic obligation. His father had served in the Great War, his grandfather in the Franco-Prussian conflict. The Hesse family, minor gentry from Hanover, measured status in generations of uniform. By April of 1945, Hesse knew the war was lost. Every rational soldier knew. The question was not victory, but survival, not triumph, but the manner of ending. His company, or what remained of it, 43 men from an original complement of 180, had spent 3 weeks conducting fighting retreats through the industrial wasteland of the Ruhr, past bombed-out factories and skeletal apartment blocks, past columns of refugees and deserters swinging from lamp-posts with cardboard signs declaring them traitors. The Feldgendarmerie, Hitler's military police, had grown more vicious as defeat approached, hanging anyone who suggested surrender, anyone who failed to die properly. On April 15th, Model dissolved the Ruhr pocket rather than surrender it intact, releasing his soldiers from their oath and inviting them to attempt breakout or capitulation as conscience dictated. Model himself would choose suicide a week later, unable to reconcile surrender with his conception of honor. Hesse's company commander had made the decision for his men. They would attempt to break through American lines at dawn, heading east toward the shrinking territory still controlled by the Reich. The breakout had lasted 7 minutes before American artillery transformed it into slaughter. Hesse remembered the sound, a freight train roar that arrived from everywhere simultaneously, and then the earth erupting in columns of fire and steel. He'd thrown himself into a roadside depression, felt the concussion wave pass over him like a physical hand, and then the pain in his arm and the wetness spreading across his sleeve. When the barrage stopped, the silence felt louder than the explosions. Half his company was gone, not retreated, not scattered, but simply gone, converted to components too small to recognize. The survivors raised their hands. The Americans appeared from tree lines, professional and cautious, weapons trained but not firing. Hesse had surrendered conscious but drifting, aware that his arm hung at an impossible angle, aware that blood soaked his uniform, aware that the skull ringing from the close shell burst meant concussion, possibly fracture. He'd expected a bullet. Instead, medics had appeared, Americans with red crosses on white armbands, and they'd stabilized his arm with inflatable splints. Inflatable, he'd thought, with distant wonder, what kind of army has inflatable medical equipment, and loaded him onto a truck with other wounded prisoners. The journey to the field hospital existed in his memory as disconnected impressions. The truck's suspension, surprisingly gentle compared to Wehrmacht vehicles. A medic checking his pulse and pupils every few minutes. The strange relief of knowing he would not have to make any more decisions, that the war had ended for him, whether Germany surrendered or not. And then, the operating room. Hesse had expected to wait. Wounded enemy prisoners surely ranked last for treatment, behind Allied casualties, behind even the German wounded who might provide intelligence value. Instead, within 30 minutes of arrival, orderlies had transferred him to a surgical table. A doctor, American, middle-aged, with the professionally distant expression of surgeons everywhere, had examined the arm, speaking in English to his team, while a translator relayed information to Hesse. Compound fracture, radius and ulna. Significant soft tissue damage, but neurovascular bundle intact. Will reduce the fracture, insert temporary fixators, close the wounds. Standard protocol. Standard protocol. For an enemy soldier, for a member of the Wehrmacht that had devastated Europe, that had committed atrocities Hesse himself had witnessed, even if he'd lacked the courage to oppose them. And this American surgeon spoke of standard protocol. The anesthesiologist, a captain with graying temples, had leaned close while preparing the ether mask. "You're going to be fine, Lieutenant. This is a good hospital. Best fracture specialist in the Third Army, operated on Patton's nephew last month. He'll take care of you." Then the ether smell, thick and sweet, and the descent into chemical darkness. Hesse woke to discover that the propaganda had lied about nearly everything. not gradually, not through subtle realizations. The truth arrived in a series of small, concrete shocks that accumulated like compound interest, each one insignificant alone, but collectively devastating to his carefully constructed worldview. First shock: the quality of care. When the surgeon, Major Lawrence Brennan, Johns Hopkins Medical School, age 43, as Hesse would later learn, examined him that first afternoon, he did so with the same meticulous attention Hesse had observed Wehrmacht doctors reserve for valuable officers. Brennan palpated the surgical site, checked the fixators, tested nerve response in Hesse's fingers. "Good," Brennan said through the translator. "No signs of compartment syndrome. Circulation is strong. You'll have full function back in 3 to 4 months if you follow the rehabilitation protocol. 3 to 4 months, full function." Hesse had seen what passed for German military medicine by 1945. Overwhelmed surgeons performing amputations without anesthesia, infection rates approaching 70%, morphine so scarce that soldiers bit down on leather straps during debridement. And this American doctor spoke casually of rehabilitation protocols. "Why?" Hesse asked, the question becoming his constant refrain. "Why operate on me at all?" Brennan looked genuinely puzzled. "You have a compound fracture requiring surgical intervention. What else would we do? I'm a prisoner, the enemy." "You're a patient," Brennan corrected. "The Geneva Convention requires—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider his approach. "Look, Lieutenant, I took an oath when I became a doctor. That oath doesn't have a clause about checking nationality before treating people. You needed surgery. I provided surgery. It's not complicated, but it was complicated. Hesse's entire political education had rested on the premise that different peoples possessed different intrinsic worth, that humanitarian principles represented weakness that strong nations exploited. He'd been taught that Americans, mongrelized, Jew-controlled, culturally degenerate, lacked the discipline for real civilization, that they would collapse when confronted with German will. Yet here he lay in a hospital that functioned with mechanical efficiency, treated by doctors who appeared genuinely affronted by the suggestion they might withhold care from enemy wounded. Second shock: the egalitarian atmosphere, field hospital. 77 housed both Allied wounded and prisoners of war in the same facility, separated by ward but sharing the same medical staff, the same equipment, the same pharmaceutical supplies. Hesse, placed in a private recovery room as per Geneva Convention protocols for officers, could hear through the thin walls the sounds of medical routine. Nurses making rounds, orderlies distributing meals, doctors conducting examinations. The rhythm was identical in all wards. No screaming, no begging, no sounds of deliberate cruelty. His roommate for the second day, they'd moved another wounded German officer in to optimize bed usage, was Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a logistics officer who'd taken shrapnel in both legs during the same failed breakout. Weber had been captured 3 days earlier and had spent 72 hours in the hospital before Hesse's arrival. "It's all like this," Weber said, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been shattered. "The nurses don't differentiate. Yesterday I watched an American corporal, argue with a major about getting better pain medication for a German private who was crying. The corporal won the argument. They increased the dosage." Hesse absorbed this information in silence. "And the food," Weber continued. "They feed us the same rations as American soldiers. I've gained weight in captivity, can you imagine? 3 years of retreat, surviving on black bread and ersatz coffee, and I gain weight as a prisoner of war." Third shock, the most destabilizing, came from the nurses. Army Nurse Corps officers, professional women who'd volunteered for military service, who treated German prisoners with the same brisk efficiency they brought to treating American casualties. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the dark-haired captain who'd first checked his IV, rotated through his room 3 times per shift. She changed his dressings, monitored his vital signs, administered medication, and did so without comment on his nationality, his service, his presence in her country's uniform, in a war against her country. On the fourth day, when Hesse's concussion symptoms had decreased enough to allow conversation, he asked her directly, "Don't you hate us? We've killed your countrymen." Morrison paused in the act of checking his temperature. She considered the question with visible seriousness, which somehow made her answer more devastating when it arrived. "Hate requires energy I don't have," she said finally. "I worked a 36-hour shift 3 days ago. We had 57 wounded come in from a skirmish near Essen, 31 American, 26 German. I treated them in the order they arrived and based on triage priority. I didn't have time to hate anyone. I barely had time to remember my own name." She recorded his temperature, 98.4, normal, and continued, "Besides, you're not us when you're in this bed. You're a patient with a compound fracture and a concussion. That's all I can afford to see." But the most shattering revelation came not from what the Americans did, but from what they didn't do. Hesse had been prepared for interrogation, for propaganda lectures, for the psychological warfare tactics he'd been told Americans employed. Instead, he received medical treatment and nothing else. No one questioned him about troop movements, tactical intelligence, command structure. No one demanded he denounce National Socialism or pledge allegiance to democracy. The Americans simply fixed his arm and left him alone to process the cognitive dissonance of being treated with professional respect by the people he'd been taught to regard as cultural inferiors. By the second week, Hesse had begun physical therapy. The rehabilitation ward occupied the hospital's East Wing, a converted warehouse where American occupational therapists applied modern techniques to restore function to damaged bodies. Hesse's therapist, Corporal James Chen, age 24, UCLA graduate, son of Chinese immigrants, guided him through exercises designed to maintain range of motion while the bone healed. 10 repetitions, Chen instructed, demonstrating the wrist rotation movement. Stop if you feel sharp pain, but push through general discomfort. The goal is to prevent the muscles from atrophying while the fracture knits. Hesse watched Chen's hands, competent, gentle, guiding his damaged arm through movements that hurt, but didn't injure. Another Chinese American, another data point that contradicted everything the Reich had taught about racial hierarchies. Chen's parents had immigrated to California in 1923. Chen himself had volunteered for the Army in 1942, trained as a physical therapist, and now spent his days restoring function to the bodies of men who'd served a regime that would have classified him as subhuman. "Does it bother you?" Hesse asked during one session. "Treating German prisoners?" Chen looked up from adjusting the resistance on the therapy band. "Does what bother me? Germany, we believed." Hesse struggled with the verb tenses, with the sudden uncertainty about whether he still subscribed to ideologies he'd accepted as fact 3 weeks earlier. "We were taught that certain races were inferior. Your people, Jews, Slavs. And yet you're helping me recover." Chen's expression remained neutral. "I'm helping you recover because that's my job. Your beliefs about my people don't change the fact that your radius and ulna need to heal in proper alignment." He paused, seemed to debate whether to continue, then added, "My parents left China because they believed America offered something different than racial hierarchy. My father spent 20 years as a laundry owner in Oakland getting called names and having rocks thrown at his windows. He still believed in the American idea, not the American reality, but the idea that people could be judged on what they do rather than what they are. So when Germany declared war on the U.S., I volunteered, because I'd rather live in a country that imperfectly practices egalitarianism than perfectly practices racial purity." Hesse absorbed this speech in silence, working his wrist through the prescribed rotations, feeling the metal fixators shift beneath his skin with each movement. The pain served as a useful anchor, a physical sensation he could focus on instead of the psychological vertigo of having his entire worldview systematically dismantled by enemy kindness. The rehabilitation ward housed 23 patients, 14 American, 9 German, all recovering from various orthopedic injuries. Hesse observed the daily routines with anthropological fascination. The Americans joked with each other, complained about the food, which Hesse found astonishingly abundant compared to Wehrmacht rations, and showed photographs of families and girlfriends. The German prisoners maintained more reserve, uncertain how to behave in captivity, but they weren't mistreated for their silence. What struck Hesse most forcefully was the absence of visible hierarchy based on anything except medical need. A black American sergeant with a shattered femur received the same aggressive treatment as a white lieutenant with a similar injury. The German prisoners, regardless of rank, participated in the same therapy protocols as Allied wounded. Chen worked with everyone equally, adjusting his approach based on injury type and patient personality, rather than nationality or race. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, the hospital learned of Germany's unconditional surrender. Hesse expected celebration, perhaps gloating, possibly retribution. Instead, the American staff maintained professional composure. Major Brennan made rounds that evening as usual, checking surgical sites and medication regimens with his characteristic thoroughness. When he reached Hesse's bed, he paused. "The war in Europe is over," Brennan said simply. "You'll be transferred to a POW camp once you're medically cleared, probably another 2 weeks." Hesse nodded, unable to formulate a response. Germany had ceased to exist as a sovereign state. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Everything he'd fought for, everything his friends had died for, had collapsed into unconditional surrender. Brennan seemed to read his expression. "For what it's worth, Lieutenant, you conducted yourself well here. No complaints from the staff. I hope the peace treats you better than the war did." Then he moved to the next bed, continuing his rounds, leaving Hesse to contemplate the strange mercy of being told he'd conducted himself well by the enemy surgeon who'd saved his arm. The transfer came on May 22nd. Hesse's fracture had stabilized sufficiently for him to leave the hospital, though he would need continued rehabilitation. An army truck transported him and 11 other recovered German prisoners to POW Camp Remagen, a sprawling facility near the Rhine that housed approximately 40,000 German soldiers awaiting repatriation. The camp shocked him again, though he was learning to expect his expectations to be contradicted. Instead of the brutal internment facility propaganda had described, Remagen functioned as a temporary city with its own internal organization. The Americans had implemented officer privileges according to Geneva Convention requirements. Officers weren't required to work, received modest monetary allowances, and were housed in separate compounds with better facilities. But the real revelation was the re-education program. The Americans called it intellectual reorientation, a systematic effort to counter 12 years of Nazi propaganda by exposing German prisoners to information that had been carefully suppressed within the Reich. Participation was voluntary, but the alternatives were boredom and isolation, so attendance was high. Hesse, with time to think and an arm that precluded heavy labor, even if he'd been required to perform it, attended the lectures. The program coordinator, Captain Robert Harrison, former Yale history professor, now U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division, introduced the curriculum with uncomfortable directness. "Gentlemen," he said to the assembled group of 200 German officers, speaking through a translator, "you have been lied to. Systematically, comprehensively, for over a decade. Our goal here is not to make you into Americans or to force you to adopt our political system. Our goal is simply to show you the truth about what your government did in your name. What you choose to believe afterward is your decision." What followed was the most psychologically brutal month of Hesse's life. Worse than combat, worse than capture, worse than the physical pain of his injuries. Harrison and his team presented evidence, photographs from liberated concentration camps, testimony from survivors, documents bearing official Reich stamps ordering the systematic murder of millions. They showed newsreels that German censors had suppressed, played recordings of speeches Hitler had given to party functionaries but never broadcast to the general population, distributed copies of the Wannsee Conference protocols outlining the administrative details of genocide. Hesse's first reaction was denial. These were propaganda fabrications, atrocity stories invented to justify Allied war crimes. But Harrison anticipated this response. He brought in witnesses, German civilians from nearby towns who'd been forced to tour Buchenwald after its liberation. who'd seen the crematoriums and the piles of corpses and the survivors with their visible ribs and hollow eyes. He brought in German officers who'd served in the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that had followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union, men who provided first-hand accounts of mass executions. I shot 237 people over 3 days in Ukraine. One former SS lieutenant testified flatly. Men, women, children. We lined them up at the edge of a pit and shot them in the back of the head. Then we covered them with lime and dirt. We did this in 53 villages. The orders came from Heydrich through Ohlendorf. Everything was documented. Nothing was hidden from command. Hesse sat through these presentations with a sensation of physical illness. Not because he hadn't suspected. Fragments of truth had penetrated even the Wehrmacht's careful information control. Rumors of special actions in the East, whispered stories about camps where people entered but never left. But suspecting and knowing were different cognitive acts. Suspecting allowed plausible deniability, the comfort of uncertainty. Knowing required moral reckoning. The American re-education program forced that reckoning through sheer documentary weight. They didn't just tell the prisoners about Nazi crimes, they showed them photographs, played them testimony, handed them actual orders bearing actual signatures of actual officials Hesse had been taught to regard as Germany's best and brightest. The evidence accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, until denial became psychologically impossible. What devastated Hesse most completely was the contrast between the treatment he'd received in American captivity and the treatment the Reich had designed for its victims. The Americans had operated on his arm using the same techniques they applied to their own soldiers. They'd fed him the same rations. They'd treated him according to the Geneva Convention, a document the Nazi leadership had selectively ignored whenever inconvenient. Meanwhile, Germany had constructed an industrial apparatus for murder, had systematically violated every principle of humanitarian warfare, had committed atrocities so extensive that the English language didn't contain adequate vocabulary to describe them. He thought about Lieutenant Morrison, the nurse who'd changed his dressings with professional detachment and told him she lacked energy for hate. He thought about Corporal Chen, who'd guided his damaged arm through rehabilitation exercises despite belonging to a race Nazi ideology classified as inferior. He thought about Major Brennan, who'd saved his arm because medical ethics didn't include a nationality clause. And he thought about the regime he'd served, not as a true believer perhaps, but as a participant, as someone who'd worn the uniform and carried the weapon and contributed, however peripherally, to the system that had produced Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor. The Americans provided access to newspapers for the first time in years, real newspapers, uncensored, publishing articles critical of their own government's policies. Hesse read about American race riots, about labor disputes, about congressional debates over foreign policy. The Americans apparently believed their soldiers could read about domestic problems without losing faith in democratic institutions. This, too, contradicted everything Hesse had learned about totalitarian necessity, about the requirement for ideological unity to maintain state power. In the camp library, a tent containing several thousand books, many in German, Hesse found works that had been banned in the Reich since 1933. He read Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, forbidden because it portrayed war as horror rather than glory. He read newspapers' accounts of the Nuremberg race laws from American and British sources, seeing for the first time how the outside world had viewed Germany's descent into racial madness. He read Thomas Mann's essays on German culture, written from exile, mourning the destruction of everything valuable in German civilization by the Nazi regime. The education wasn't passive. Harrison organized discussion groups where German officers could process what they were learning. These sessions often devolved into arguments, with some prisoners maintaining that the evidence was fabricated, that Germany had fought a legitimate defensive war, that the Allies had committed equivalent crimes. But the documentary evidence kept accumulating, and gradually, painfully, the cognitive dissonance became too great to sustain. During one discussion session, a former Panzer captain named Ernst Vogel articulated what many were thinking. If all of this is true, and I'm not conceding it is, but if, then what were we fighting for? What did our comrades die for? Harrison, to his credit, didn't provide an easy answer. "That's the question you'll need to wrestle with for the rest of your lives," he said. "I can show you evidence. I can't tell you how to construct meaning from it." For Hesse, meaning began to crystallize around a single memory, the moment he'd woken in the American field hospital and asked the nurse why she was helping him. Her answer, "Because you're a patient," had seemed inadequate at the time, even insulting in its simplicity. But as he sat in Camp Remagen processing evidence of Nazi atrocities, that simple statement acquired profound significance. Morrison had treated him as a patient rather than an enemy, because her professional ethics didn't recognize the categorical distinctions on which Nazi ideology depended. She'd seen him as a human being requiring medical care, full stop. No racial calculations, no ideological assessments, no determination of worthiness. This was the counter-principle to everything the Reich had represented. Nazi ideology had divided humanity into worthy and unworthy, Aryan and subhuman, those who deserved to live, and those who existed only as obstacles or resources. The American medical staff had rejected that division not through explicit political argument, but through the simple act of providing care without discrimination. Hesse's arm was healing. Major Brennan had predicted 3 to 4 months for full function. At 6 weeks, Hesse could already perform most rehabilitation exercises without significant pain. The metal fixators would remain in place for another month, but he'd recovered enough range of motion to write, to eat, to perform basic tasks. The arm would heal completely, leaving only scars and a slight stiffness in cold weather. He would retain full function because an American surgeon had applied his skills without consideration of whether the patient deserved to recover. That fact, that simple, undeniable fact, became the foundation for Hesse's transformation. Not dramatic conversion, not sudden ideological reversal, but a slow, painful recognition that he'd served a regime whose core principle had been the denial of common humanity, and that the enemy he'd fought had demonstrated, through thousands of small professional choices, a competing principle, that all people possessed inherent worth, regardless of nationality, race, or political affiliation. By August of 1945, when the camp screened newsreel footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hesse had progressed far enough in his moral reckoning to feel appropriate horror. The atomic bombs had killed approximately 200,000 people, most of them civilians. The Americans in the camp reacted with mixed emotions: relief that the war had ended, discomfort with the weapon's indiscriminate destructiveness. Some German prisoners seized on the bombings as proof that all sides committed atrocities, that moral equivalence existed between Allied and Axis conduct. But Hesse, by this point, had learned to distinguish between terrible choices made in extremity and systematic programs of extermination. The Americans had dropped atomic bombs to end a war, a decision that could be debated on strategic and moral grounds. Germany had constructed industrial facilities specifically designed to murder entire populations, a project that admitted no strategic justification. The difference mattered. Repatriation came in stages. Lower-ranking soldiers went first, transported back to Germany beginning in late 1945. Officers considered higher risk for supporting Nazi revival remained in custody longer. Hesse finally received clearance for return in March of 1946, after nearly a year in American captivity. The Germany he returned to barely resembled the nation he'd left. Cities lay in ruins: Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden reduced to rubble. The economy had collapsed. Food shortages approached famine conditions in some regions. The Allied occupation had divided the country into zones, with Soviet forces controlling the east and American, British, and French forces administering the west. But physical destruction, however extensive, proved less significant than the moral catastrophe. Germany existed in a state of collective trauma, forced to confront not just military defeat, but evidence of unprecedented atrocities committed in the German name. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, presented systematic evidence of Nazi crimes to the world. Denazification programs attempted to remove former party members from positions of authority. Educational curricula were revised to include accurate history rather than Nazi mythology. Hesse returned to Hanover to find his family's apartment building damaged but standing. His father had died in January of 1946. Heart failure, complicated by malnutrition and the psychological shock of Germany's total defeat. His mother had survived, aged 20 years in appearance, her hands trembling with what doctors called nervous exhaustion. "What will you do?" she asked him the evening of his return, sitting in their damaged kitchen sharing ersatz coffee and black bread. The same question millions of Germans were asking themselves and each other. Hesse had thought about this question for months. Many former Wehrmacht officers were attempting to reconstruct military careers, joining police forces or seeking positions in the nascent West German defense establishment. Others emigrated, unwilling to live in an occupied country. Some simply drifted, traumatized and directionless, unable to adapt to civilian life. But Hesse's experience in American captivity had provided unexpected clarity. He'd learned that professional competence divorced from moral framework could serve monstrous ends, that following orders and maintaining discipline meant nothing if the orders themselves violated basic humanity. He'd also learned, through the example of Morrison, Brennan, Chen, and dozens of other American medical personnel, that humanitarian principles could be practiced concretely through the unglamorous work of providing care without discrimination. "I'm going to apply to the Red Cross," he told his mother. She looked at him with incomprehension. "The Red Cross? You're an officer." "You could. The Red Cross needs reform," Hesse interrupted. "During the war, it was completely Nazified. Run by SS General Grawitz, perverted into an arm of racial policy. Now it's being rebuilt as an actual humanitarian organization. They need people who understand what went wrong, who won't repeat those mistakes." His mother studied him in the dim light of their kitchen, seeing something in his face that hadn't been there when he'd left for war 6 years earlier. "What happened to you in captivity?" Hesse looked at his right arm. Healed now, functional, marked by scars where American surgeons had inserted metal fixators to hold shattered bone in proper alignment while it knit. "They saved my arm," he said simply. "I was the enemy, and they saved my arm. They didn't have to. The Geneva Convention required adequate care, not excellent care. But they gave me excellent care anyway. And then they showed me what Germany had done, what we had done, to people we classified as unworthy of care. The contrast changed everything." Hesse's application to the German Red Cross was approved in June of 1946. The organization, being reconstructed under Allied supervision, sought former military personnel who could contribute administrative skills but had demonstrable commitment to humanitarian principles rather than Nazi ideology. Hesse's documentation of his treatment in American captivity, combined with letters of reference from Camp Remigen's re-education staff, satisfied the screening requirements. He began as a logistics coordinator for refugee services in Lower Saxony, helping to manage the distribution of relief supplies to the millions of displaced persons flooding into Western Germany. The work was unglamorous, tracking inventory, coordinating transportation, ensuring supplies reached intended recipients rather than being diverted to black markets. But it was honest work, guided by the principle that all people in need deserved assistance regardless of nationality or political background. The principle proved difficult to practice. Some German Red Cross volunteers argued that German refugees, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe under brutal conditions, deserved priority over other displaced persons. Hesse found himself repeatedly citing the Geneva Convention and the fundamental Red Cross commitment to impartiality, drawing on examples he'd observed in American captivity. "When I was wounded and captured," he told one district meeting in 1947, "American doctors operated on my arm using the same techniques they used for their own soldiers. They didn't determine my worthiness for treatment based on nationality or ideology. They treated me because I was injured. That's the principle we're supposed to embody. Everyone in need receives help. No exceptions." The argument didn't always persuade. Post-war Germany seethed with resentment, with a desire to claim victim status, with the psychological need to avoid confronting German culpability for the war and its atrocities. But Hesse persisted, using his own experience as evidence that humanitarian principles could be practiced even toward enemies, that professional ethics could transcend political hatred. By 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was formally established in the Western zones, Hesse had risen to regional director for Red Cross operations in Hanover. He helped develop training programs that emphasized impartial assistance, that taught new volunteers to see need rather than nationality, that insisted on professional standards regardless of personal feelings about recipients. The work felt like redemption of a kind, incomplete, imperfect, but genuine. Hesse couldn't undo his service in the Wehrmacht, couldn't resurrect the dead, couldn't erase German crimes. But he could apply the lessons he'd learned in American captivity, that people possessed inherent worth, that professional ethics required seeing individuals rather than categories, that the unglamorous work of providing care without discrimination represented a practical alternative to ideological hatred. His arm ached sometimes, particularly in cold weather or before rain. The metal fixators had been removed in 1947, leaving only scars and slight stiffness as permanent reminders. But the arm worked. Hesse could lift supplies, write reports, perform the physical tasks his job required. Major Brennan's skill had given him that function, and the fact of that gift, unearned, undeserved, provided anyway, remained the most powerful argument against the ideology he'd once accepted. In 1953, Hesse received an unexpected letter from the United States. It came from Major Lawrence Brennan, now civilian Dr. Brennan. Professor of orthopedic surgery at Johns Hopkins, the letter explained that Brennan was conducting a long-term study on combat-related compound fractures, tracking patient outcomes years after initial treatment. He'd obtained Hesse's address through Red Cross records and was writing to inquire about the arm's recovery. Hesse responded with a detailed medical history. Full range of motion restored by 1948, occasional stiffness, but no chronic pain, complete functional recovery. But he also included a personal paragraph. I write to thank you not only for the surgical skill that saved my arm, but for the example of professional humanity you demonstrated. Your decision to treat an enemy prisoner with the same care you would provide to American soldiers taught me more about ethics than 12 years of Nazi education. I now work for the German Red Cross, attempting to practice the principle you exemplified, that all people in need deserve help, regardless of nationality or ideology. I wanted you to know that your work in April of 1945 had consequences beyond orthopedic recovery. Brennan's response arrived 3 months later. It was characteristically brief. I'm glad the arm healed well. As for the rest, I was doing my job. But I appreciate knowing that the care made a difference beyond the medical outcome. Good luck with your Red Cross work. The world needs more people committed to helping without discrimination. Hesse kept the letter in his desk drawer next to his Geneva Convention handbook and his Red Cross identification. Sometimes during difficult moments, when volunteers argued about prioritizing German refugees, when bureaucracy threatened to override humanitarian need, when the weight of past complicity felt unbearable, he would reread Brennan's words. I was doing my job. That simple statement contained profound wisdom, that professional ethics, practiced consistently without ideological corruption, could constitute a form of resistance to inhumanity. By the time Hesse retired from the Red Cross in 1973, he had spent 27 years practicing the principle he'd learned in American captivity. The organization he'd helped rebuild bore little resemblance to the Nazified institution that had existed during the war. It provided disaster relief, supported refugees, trained medical personnel, and operated according to the fundamental Red Cross principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Hesse's contribution had been modest in the grand scheme of reconstruction. He'd supervised the distribution of supplies, trained volunteers, enforced standards of impartial assistance. He hadn't performed dramatic rescues or made historic decisions, but he'd helped ensure that an organization once perverted to serve genocidal ideology now functioned according to humanitarian principles. In retirement, Hesse occasionally spoke to school groups about his wartime experiences. Not about combat glory, there had been none, but about the moral education he'd received in American captivity. He would show students the scars on his right arm and explain how American surgeons had saved it, how American nurses had provided care without hatred, how American physical therapists had restored function without regard for his nationality. I served a regime that divided humanity into worthy and unworthy, he would tell these students, teenagers born long after the war's end. I was taught that certain peoples were subhuman, that humanitarian principles represented weakness. Then I was captured and treated with professional respect by the people I'd been told were racially inferior. That contradiction between ideology and experience forced me to recognize that I'd believed lies. The Americans didn't argue with my beliefs. They simply demonstrated, through thousands of small professional choices, that people possessed inherent worth regardless of nationality or race. That lesson changed my life. Hesse died in 1987 at age 69, his right arm still functional, still bearing the scars where metal fixators had held broken bone while it healed. His obituary in the Hanover newspaper noted his 27 years with the German Red Cross, his contributions to refugee services, his work training new volunteers in humanitarian principles. What the obituary couldn't capture was the transformation those 27 years represented. The journey from Wehrmacht officer who'd accepted Nazi ideology without deep examination to Red Cross administrator who dedicated his life to practicing impartial humanitarian assistance. That transformation had begun in a field hospital near Remagen in April of 1945, when enemy medical personnel had treated him according to professional ethics rather than political hatred. The room they'd given him, that separate recovery space he'd initially viewed with suspicion and confusion, had been his classroom. Not through explicit instruction, but through example. Lieutenant Morrison checking his IV without comment on nationality. Major Brennan discussing rehabilitation protocols without ideological preamble. Corporal Chen guiding his damaged arm through exercises despite belonging to a race Nazi ideology classified as inferior. These Americans had demonstrated, through the unglamorous work of providing medical care, an alternative to the racial hierarchy Hesse had been taught to accept. They'd saved his arm. More significantly, they'd shown him that professional ethics could be practiced without reference to the categorical distinctions on which Nazi ideology depended. They'd treated him as a patient requiring care, as a human being with inherent worth, as someone deserving help despite being their enemy. That lesson, learned through confusion and shock and gradual recognition, had shaped the remaining 42 years of Hesse's life. His work with the Red Cross represented not atonement exactly. German crimes admitted no adequate atonement, but the attempt to practice what he'd learned, to apply the principle of impartial assistance he'd observed in American captivity, to help ensure that humanitarian organizations served humanitarian ends rather than ideological agendas. The transformation hadn't been dramatic. No single moment of conversion, no sudden reversal of belief. Just the slow, painful recognition that his education had been based on lies, that the enemy had demonstrated more humanity than his own regime, that professional ethics practiced without ideological corruption could constitute a form of moral resistance. His arm worked. That simple fact, the result of skilled surgery performed without discrimination, remained the most powerful argument against the ideology he'd once accepted, and the most concrete reminder of what he'd learned in the room they'd given him, the space where his world had been turned upside down and rebuilt on more honest foundations.